Sociologist with a research interest in human-non-human relations, and he's studied the British animal protection movement and social movements in general. His latest journal publication was about the potential criminalisation of protests in Ireland. And today he's going to speak about towards understanding the human-non-human relations.
Which is pretty easy to do in 20 minutes. So,
yes.
Thanks for that. Thanks for coming to my session. Sociologists are always incredibly grateful that anyone will listen to them. So thanks for that, and thanks for the organisers to invite me now. Yeah, so I'm a sociologist for my sins, currently working at UCD, but I do have an activist background, and if you like, this is my activist CV. So the top part is really from the 1980s, especially things like BOAV, that was 1982, the Sea Shepherd involvement, those kind of things. And a bit lower down, that's the current kind of thing that I'm doing. So the reason that I show this is not to show off, it's to say that I've been on both sides of the divide in a sense, so the activist side and the academic side. And what I've done is I've used the academia to try and feed into some understanding of the activist side of things. So that's how it kind of works. In fact, as Martin said, I did look at the British animal protection movement, the MA level, and then in terms of my research work, I looked at the support pillars of cultural speciesism, which are philosophy and theology, as was mentioned, and also everyday social practice. And obviously, as a sociologist, it's the everyday social practice that's interesting to me. And in fact, one of the things that I do, one of the talks I do based on the work, actually it wouldn't work in this audience, because what I would do is I would give people pen and paper and ask them very simply to draw a farm. Yeah? And you can guarantee that most of the drawings that come back are of an entirely free-range farm. The smiling farmer and the smiling wife and the chicken scratching in the dirt, the pig in the mud pool and the ponds with the ducks, etc., etc. In other words, something completely removed from what we understand as animal advocates about the reality of life for animals which are regarded as if they were food. So I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to focus on is I'm really going to kind of look at the social construction of moral in and out groups. And I'm going to try and do that in a couple of ways. One is just to give us some sociological understanding about how we construct different groups and how we can push people and other beings away in that sense. And also, I think it says something about the social movement that we're in as well, or the social movements that we may be involved in. So that's the aim. Whether I succeed is another matter, but we'll see. So we start off with Bauman and Reagan. Now, Bauman is a sociologist, and Tom Reagan probably doesn't need any introduction in this audience in the sense that he wrote The Case for Animal Rights in 1983, so well-known animal rights philosopher. And what they both say in different places is that the universe of moral obligations is remarkably non-universal. What Bauman says is that human beings have demonstrated an apparent need to draw categorical distinctions and differences between groups. Reagan, for his argument, says that there are exercises of exclusion that have led to what he regards as the formation of non-ideal moral communities. Both of the theories suggest further that a great deal of effort has been expended by human beings in guarding these very carefully drawn boundaries. So advocates for animal rights and people involved in social movements in a general sense are challenging some of the relevance of this moral boundary drawing. But through Bauman's analysis, we can see sociologically that there's a great deal of benefit that has been brought over the years for the people who draw these boundaries. Boundary drawing, then, is a very powerful method of defining my group and pushing others away into stranger categories, etc., etc. A person's early social lessons, and sociologists would call that socialization, involve boundary drawing and creating these very meaningful us and them categories that we have in our minds. Now these are often based on visible distinctions and differences, so we can see some differences, we often base it on that, but they also frequently rely on taught worldviews, which are transmitted generationally. Now historically, there's been quite a few of these. What I've just picked out a couple of four really for illustration. What they tend to do as an overall package is paint the other in a very negative light. So if you like, this is a biggie in that sense. This is the Nazi construction of Jews, which was encompassed in that slogan, Jews equals lice equals typhus. This is a more kind of patriarchal idea that men are rational beings, whereas women are merely emotional. I'm not going to get involved with that argument at the moment. This is a prop for slavery, that persons of colour are subhuman. And this is a more contemporary argument, really, which is certainly prevalent at the moment in the United States presidential election. So, boundaries such as these, boundaries that we create and socially construct, effectively create moral distance with regard to those socially constructed other beings. So, our boundaries keeps the other away. So a sufficiency of distance, be it social, be it moral, can result in untold cruelty to the other. And it can also mean that their rights will be trampled on and systematically violated. Now what Bauman says for us is that human beings live in the company of other people. We live in groups, and in those groups we interactively understand that we are very much dependent on one another. Now, Bauman himself says this is a rather banal point, but it's the banality of the point that gives it its sociological importance. It's the kind of, we don't need really much to think about this idea that gives it its power, in a sense. Because living amongst others is to live in what Bauman calls manifold webs of human interdependency. So we're social beings, social animals, and we live in groups, and that group can exert a great hold on us. So in a very real sense, the group can make people. And that means that resisting the important messages of our group can be a relatively hard thing to do. Philosopher David de Grazer, for example, likewise suggests that some early socialized lessons that we learn may be extremely difficult to negate or to successfully resist. Social attitudes and many internalized and institutionalized norms and values become so firmly sedimented into society, it means it's kind of really embedded and enmeshed into the very fabric of society, that breaking away from them for some people can be quite difficult. Now, I know it's the case that for some people resisting can seem easy, but what they... Okay, so if all this seems a bit doom and gloom so far, there is some good news. Because the older one gets, then the wider one's choices become. At last, Bauman says, some dependencies can effectively become challenged and rejected, while others are actively sought and voluntarily assumed. So this is where the potential for social movements exist, I believe. Even so, human beings are never entirely liberated from their past. And a quintessential sociological statement will be to say that our experience is the experience of being free and unfree at the same time. That's one thing that we need to understand in terms of social norms and values. In addition to all of that, and this is extremely important in terms of people who want to bring about social change, which is the argument that paying the price of change has got to make sense to the people who are thinking about changing. The cost must appear worthy of being paid, in other words. There must be something about making paying attractive, and that must eventually outweigh the apparent attractiveness of avoiding change. Okay, so far then, we talked about the social construction of insiders. If there's a notion of inside, then obviously there's a notion of outside as well. So as we've just seen, and academics will call this the dialectics of freedom and dependence, At some stages in our development and our social life, there can be opportunities to choose groups. Because there's no suggestion in Bauman's account of socialization or any sociological account of socialization that the process itself can create an utterly, totally homogeneous group. There's always some space to move. So therefore, after early childhood, as I said, we've got these greater chances to change groups and to even form them. And again, the potential for social movements is there. Still leaves the question about who gets to be the insiders and who gets to be the outsiders. But what we've got now is a kind of multi-group situation. And Bauman says in this multi-group situation, individuals often judge other members of humanity by some kind of imaginary line or a continuum based on the notion of social distance. Now, variations in social distance also involve a decrease or increase in issues like empathy and fellow feeling, and that's based on mental and moral proximity. That in itself can be regulated and influenced by physical distance and psychic difference. So this is a recipe, if you like, a package, and what's really been said is that we're talking about the social construction of those very important moral in and moral out groups. We have a very nice feeling about the groups that are our we groups. We have a sense of belonging, but we don't feel the same about the they groups. Bauman is describing how the other can be seen as less morally valuable. Others can be seen as strangers, who by definition, cases in which the moral proximity has been lessened, then that means our moral responsibility is likewise lessened as well. The lack of moral proximity can increase the likelihood of overcoming or overriding what Bauman calls our animal pity. Our animal pity, he says, is generated by human beings just being with other human beings. We can override that by a lack of moral proximity. There are different levels of this idea of moral proximity. On a kind of low level, if you like, we could call it something like civil inattention. The civil inattention is only a small step away from something more serious, like moral indifference, being indifferent about the plight of the other. Bauman says that both of those can lead to a certain heartlessness and a disregard for the needs of others. So, as I have implied throughout then, once constructed, our meaningful barriers need, naturally enough, to be jealously or at least studiously guarded. Now, in terms of sociological convention, it's usual for us to focus on notions like social class and race and gender in order to explore social differences which may result in levels of inequality, and that's related to issues of ethics and morality. Bauman himself, interestingly for us, I suppose, appears to acknowledge that perhaps the deepest divide of all is the divide at the species level. For example, he argues that a human being is likely to remain as a moral subject if they can remain categorized as a human being in the first place. Bauman notes that humans have evolved notions that being human on its own entitles a subject to special treatment. This is the proper treatment reserved for human beings only, and of course something that we're trying to do something about, culturally, legally, etc., etc. As a building block or consequence of human rights thinking, this construction of proper treatment is so strong that Bauman claims this, that one may even say that the concept of moral object and human being have the same referent. Their respective scopes overlap, another thing that we're trying to challenge. In terms of moral proximity and physical treatment, there is, of course, a flip side, and Bauman writes, whenever certain persons or categories of people are denied the rights to our moral responsibility, then they are treated as lesser humans, flawed humans, which is a big theme in Bauman's work, being flawed, not fully human, or downright non-human. So, if being just less than human can be a serious threat to our moral standing, then we just have to think about the thoroughly unforgiving status of non-human. That pushes us further and furthest away from moral consideration. It can put us the furthest away from the likelihood of being treated as morally valuable, at least in a fundamental sense. And so, historically, some human communities, in fact, have called themselves names that literally mean human. And that automatically pushes other people on the outside. It creates others there and then. Philosopher Mary Midgley, for example, suggests that this casts the other outside of the boundary of ethical concern. And by the same token, Stephen Clark, another philosopher, says that human slaves have always been, or regularly categorized as non-human animals, or at least as distant, beast-like barbarians, he says. For his part, going back to Bauman, and probably thinking about his own pretty disturbing analysis of the Holocaust, he says, our century has been notorious for the appearance of highly influential worldviews, so worldviews come back in there, that call for the exclusion of whole categories of the population, classes, nations, races, religion, from the universe of moral obligations. Okay, let's bring this a little bit down to earth and a bit nearer to our concerns, perhaps, when we return then to Tom Reagan. Because from the part, going back to Bauman, and probably thinking about his own pretty disturbing analysis of the Holocaust, he says, our century has been notorious for the appearance of highly influential worldviews, so worldviews come back in there, that call for the exclusion of whole categories of the population, classes, nations, races, religion, from the universe of moral obligations. Okay, let's bring this a little bit down to earth and a bit nearer to our concerns, perhaps, when we return then to Tom Reagan. Because from Reagan's North American perspective, he examines the notion of the non-universal nature of the universe of moral obligations. Now, I'm going to say that again, because it's a hell of a sentence, but also it kind of nails it on the head in terms of what we're talking about. The non-universal nature of the universe of moral obligations. There's a chapter in 2001, depending on rights, entitled Patterns of Resistance. And Reagan outlines how religious and scientific views, in the main, have been used throughout history to attempt to block access to the moral universe. So he argues that, regardless of and because of the use of the phrase all men in the North American Independence Declaration, not all persons were deemed to be the possessors of the rights to life, to happiness, and liberty. In fact, Reagan asserts that, quote, the plain fact is that not all humans, not even all men, were included under the rubric of all men. So as we see from the slide then, Reagan concentrates on 4 excluded groups: African Americans, women, gays and lesbians, and animals other than human animals. He details the patterns of resistance that were, and still may be, utilized to preserve exclusion from our moral in-groups. So this historical exercise of exclusion is sociologically the history of boundary building, boundary guarding, and boundary maintenance for the benefit of the moral insiders. And of course, initially, the moral insiders were white male property owners. According to Reagan, as I said, this all leads to what he regards as a less than ideal moral community. And he asked this bold question at the bottom of the screen there: how do the beneficiaries of membership of less than ideal moral community act to retain their privileged status? Well, brute force is one answer, and that's frequently employed, he says, but they are, as implied, other social institutions that can assist in the process of exclusion, and we've talked about religion and scientific ones. What brings it smack bang to sociology, in my mind, is the fact that Reagan immediately acknowledges that other institutions are involved as well, not least those of economics and politics. And then he writes, and the sheer power of custom, including popular culture, the media, the songs that are sung, and the art of the time. So here then, we've got, in a sense, our problem. And our problem is cultural speciesism. So we might want to tackle that with legislation, or think about individuals being abusers and this kind of thing. But the overarching problem is cultural, which is spread throughout society. This is our overwhelming issue. Embedded into the ideology of cultural speciesism is the ideology of animal welfarism. And that says that animal use is not the issue, it's animal treatment. Yeah? And this, going back to the children's books, would say that if you've got a smiling farmer who's kind to the animals, then that's grand. Okay? The question of use is not the problem. So if there's a case of egregious harm or cruelty, what tends to happen then is the system responds by saying, well, that means that the regulation and the monitoring has failed. And what it really means is that something's got to be brought into play to boost that monitoring back up into a workable fashion. There was never any questioning of the fundamental issue about animal use. And so cultural speciesism, for me at least, and because of the powerfulness of these boundaries that we can create, is our main target. And we've got to figure out some way of trying to challenge cultural speciesism. So perhaps you can help me out and we can discuss it and see how we're going to tackle this massive thing.
Any ideas?
Can I ask you, is it possible to change?
Right. Can I just mention one thing? A lot of your talk focused on cultural speciesism, and you've made references to other cases throughout history, like racism, sexism, and homophobia, all of that. I'm wondering, to what extent do you think it is cultural, or do you think a lot of it could be perhaps biological, in the sense that we're hardwired as a species to discriminate against the other, as it were? Probably the most salient example would be human, non-human animal. And perhaps we're limited in our capacity to change or to convince people, okay, there's against the us-them barrier. So I'm kind of concerned about how much we can actually do.
Yeah, well, another good question, and the sense is that as a sociologist I would resist the hardwired biological determinism and everything else like that. And so we would kind of look at the idea of society being a social system in which people are born into it. And so you're born into a specious society, or you're born into a racist society. So the people born into apartheid South Africa were born into a very racist society. And when I was working as a projectionist near London, this guy came over from South Africa, and he still just automatically regarded people of colour, he called them Kafirs, because that's how we were brought up. So the argument is that if you're brought into a world in which the values are different, then your own values will be different, because as I said, that most people are conformists. So there is always that issue that if you've got a good society, this is a kind of Marxist point really, if you've got a good society and most people conform to it, and I mean Marx really wanted kind of like, he wanted like a population of rebels to bring about the revolution, and then after that you need a population of conformists, because they realised then that the new society is grand and everything's fine. Yeah. So I would resist the hardwired thing as a sociologist. Not completely. I mean, obviously, biology.
We're animals as well, so we're not fundamentally that different.
Well, I think it would be a good thing for most people to recognise that they're animals, which would be a good step forward from our point of view, because people tend not to self-identify as animals, or as mammals, or as apes. We tend not to do that.
Sorry, it's just related to Martin's question and to your reply. I think that in Bourdieu's theory, we could find a sort of a middle ground between sociology and ethology, let's say, because the idea of habitus has something to do with instinct, and Bourdieu says social instinct sometimes. So I think that as we are social animals and cultural animals,
yes.
Our habit can be defined as cultural and biological with the term social instinct.
Yeah,
So
and
what
I
do you
think
think
that
of this?
the shape of the society you're born into would play a big thing. And of course, you can add to that what Bauman said in his presentation, which is that we're almost instinctively moral as well. He claims that by just looking into the eye of the other, I mean, think about Live Aid, right? You look into the eye of the suffering of another, then that creates morality, he argues. And that's why, of course, a lot of animal advocates, they would focus, I'm going to go here, would focus on great apes, or on apes, because they look so similar. Okay, so you can look them, as it were, in the eye. But if you go on Facebook, you'll see a lot of pictures which just have the eye of a cow, and the eye of the horse, and people are saying, look, you can see the suffering, you know, so empathize. And so I think that that can be regarded as an instinct, but obviously the society can squash it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Just, when you're talking about animal equality in this way, you're, one group you're excluding is other forms of life outside humans and non-humans, plant kingdom, for example. And the reason most people give is that these plants can't feel and not sentient. But it's kind of, the line gets a bit blurred somewhere, you know, somewhere.
Oh, that's more
the enemies, yeah. Mollusks or bacteria, that kind of thing. So
Yeah. Well, Richard Ryder always argues that animal rights involves both line drawing and also grey areas. And what Reagan says is that if you're going to draw lines, then do it with a pencil because it's going to change. But that, you know, there are issues about that. You know, and I suppose going back to Maureen's presentation, if you look at the deontologists, then Reagan's got a different formulation to, say, Francione, who brings it back to sentience, whereas Reagan's got a more complicated idea of subject of a life. But they, you know, Francione is very unwilling to go into insects, as it were. This is not a bestiality thing or anything. But you know, whereas Jones and Ayer would do that, and so she's kind of the insect rights person, and that's why her stuff is not very popular within the social movement, because people think, geez, you know, how can we advocate for insect rights when we don't have rights for great apes and the ones that people do empathise with? And so there's a thing there. And so the boundary of our concern is shifting. I agree with that. I think what you would do then is just have a bit of a recipe of issues. So you'd have maybe an environmental aspect, you'd have a conservation thing with regard to the plant life and everything, but it wouldn't necessarily be part of strictly an animal rights argument. You'd have to probably have a mesh of the two. Although I suppose ecofeminists would argue that they would kind of try to bring all these concerns together.
Yeah, just actually on that point, you know, when I was talking about the amendments to the Bolivian and Ecuadorian constitutions, Ecuador has actually granted rights to crops against being genetically modified.
Oh, right, okay.
Wow, so,
Yes.
yeah.
Should crops have standing?
Well,
We just the last question here.
Okay, sorry.
You use the term cultural speciesism. I wonder, do you see speciesism as being fundamentally cultural in nature, or has it been brought in already? Are there other elements at play that generate it?
Yeah, I think there are other elements, but overwhelmingly perhaps cultural, in the sense that, you know, as a sociologist, we would look at how socialisation processes are very strong, and that means that generation after generation we are bringing forward societies which are specialist, and that means therefore you've got a kind of problem, because right from the start people are regarding, you know, it's kind of a human supremacist kind of argument, but the humans are right up here and other animals are here, and then you've got a bit of a kind of hierarchy situation, so there's a bit of kind of sliding around. But yeah, I would say it's probably overwhelmingly cultural, and in some senses sociologically that's the hope of it, because if it is, we can do something about it. If it's hardwired, then it's harder, and we have to, I don't know, eliminate some people or something. I didn't say that. Yeah, maybe we can do that. Yeah, we could hybridize it.
So yeah, I'd like to thank Roger again for